Great. So if everyone could put on their headphones, it does get loud in here, and this will allow you to be able to hear us. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the America is All In Pavilion this morning. I'm Marcine Mitchell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Climate Change at the World Wildlife Fund. And WWF, we are the managing partner for the America is All In Coalition. And we are coming to you here at COP at a very important moment in time. And I think as Americans, we're probably been assaulted in the hallways with our international counterparts with anxiety in their eyes, asking us, well, first, how are you doing? And then second, where are you going from here? And we know America's All In is a coalition. Our origin story is we're in 2017 when we were pulled out of the Paris Agreement. We put together this coalition of states and cities and universities, hospitals, tribal nations, civic society, businesses, in order to say that we are still in for climate action. And now is another moment like that where we need to all come together, all of society, to be in for climate action. But we know that it's still very, very important that we have climate leadership at all levels of government, including in our legislature and our Senate, as well as throughout our states and cities and civil society. And when we come together, we really are able to continue to have climate action, even when the federal government, the executive part of the federal government is not as supportive. So I'm so happy today to say that we're honored to be joined by two of the most ardent climate champions from the United States Senate, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Senator Edward Markey. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island is the current chairman of the Budget Committee and a senior member of the Environment and Public Works Committee. He's been a leading voice for climate action in the U.S. Senate since taking office in 2007. Known for his Time to Wake Up series of Senate floor speeches on climate change, which he delivered more than 280 times between 2012 and 2021. Senator Whitehouse has consistently championed climate legislation and called attention to the urgent need for climate action. He has been instrumental in pushing carbon pricing, clean energy investments, policies to protect oceans from climate impacts, and exposing the fossil fuel industry's influence in politics, and has worked effortlessly to advance bipartisan climate solutions while highlighting the economic and security threats posed by climate change. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. We also have Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts, my home state, although I'm now living in Maryland. And he's been one of Congress's most prominent champions of climate action since the 1970s. First elected to the House of Representatives in 1976 and later to the Senate in 2013. He co-authored transformative Green New Deal legislation in 2019, which helped reshape the national conversation around climate policy. Previously, his bold Waxman-Markey climate bill endeavored to establish a cap-and-trade system for greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. Throughout his career, Markey has consistently pushed for renewable energy development, stricter fuel efficiency standards, and reductions in carbon emissions. Senator Markey promises to continue defending climate as a member of the Senate Committee on Environmental and Public Works. So please, I want to express my gratitude to both of you and thank you for all you're done and helping us as climate champions. So I would like to start with you, Senator Whitehouse, and maybe you could give us a few comments about climate and where we're going on climate policy.
Sure. Let me say two things. First of all, there's no gainsaying that the Trump administration is going to actively suck on climate and that it is essentially in tow to the fossil fuel industry. So there's just no glossing that over. At the same time, California is the fifth biggest economy in the world. New York is the 10th biggest economy in the world. You put California, New York, Illinois, Minnesota, Rhode Island, other states together, Massachusetts, you end up with a really powerful economic force. So there is a latent power to be a counter to the corruption of the Trump administration. That's point one. The other point I'll make is that if you have followed the climate issue for a long time, as Eddie and I both have, it began as a scientific issue. And I was in on it early because my wife is a marine scientist, and so she knew what was going on in the oceans, and that's what brought me in early. It went from being a science issue when prudent people started to understand what the threat was, and that made it a political issue. And we've been in the throes of political combat with the fossil fuel industry denial operation for really since Citizens United, which was the thing that powered them up to do the worst of their mischief. We are now entering phase 3 on climate, from scientific to political to economic. And the economic shift is going to be very significant. And I'll just mention 2 elements of it. Element 1 is that every fiduciary in the United States of America, whether it's a corporate CEO or a corporate board with fiduciary obligations to shareholders, or an investment advisor or a stockbroker with fiduciary obligations to clients, is now in danger of liability for screwing up on climate. The facts of climate are so evident now that they've moved out of scientific prediction and political warning into economic fact. And that is like a sieve in a sink full of water. You can't plug all the holes. It is going to come in. Every fiduciary is going to be under pressure to tell the truth or face litigation when consequences arise. The second thing is that it's been widely warned from the cover article of The Economist magazine back in April to the early warnings of the chief economist for Freddie Mac, the big giant American mortgage company, that what we were likely to face was a cascading crash in which property insurance first became unaffordable and unavailable, which then cascaded into mortgage markets because you can't get a mortgage on a property that can't get insurance, which then cascaded into property values, because unless you're a corrupt billionaire who owns Mar-a-Lago and will sell to another billionaire, if you're a real person living in a development outside of Orlando, you need a buyer pool that can get a mortgage. And what the Freddie Mac economist predicted was a economic crash in coastal property values so severe that it would compare to the 2008 mortgage meltdown. So, that's already happening in Florida. We're in the early stage of that meltdown, and as Ernest Hemingway said, bankruptcies happen slowly and then all at once. We're in the getting to be all at once phase there. And it's past the insurance markets, which are already wobbly and failing. It's already affecting the mortgage markets there, and in certain places, it's already affecting property values. Beside the coastal property value crash risk, as what we saw in the Carolinas, there's going to be a new effort to avoid insurance in areas that are vulnerable to inland flooding in previously unpredicted ways. And out west is a wildfire geographic template that is putting enormous pressure on insurance out there. So the warning from Freddie Mac is now actually triple. It's not just coastal property values crash, it's coastal, severe inland flooding, and wildfire-adjacent property values crash. And those pressures are going to be unstoppable because economics is unstoppable. So I'll stop there.
So Senator Markey, could you give us a few opening remarks?
Thank you. And just to follow up on what Senator Whitehouse was just saying, we had 2 hurricanes going from Florida up through North Carolina to Virginia just 8 weeks ago, Hurricane Milton and Helene, it caused $300 billion worth of damage. The entire defense budget of the United States is $800 billion. Just to give you an idea of the scale of that damage. And as Senator Whitehouse was saying, it's going to affect insurance rates going forward in all those regions because of the much broader reach that climate change now has. There's no escaping it. They thought in North Carolina they were up in the mountains and protected. They weren't. People all across Florida thought they might live in places that were protected. They weren't. So it's not going away. And neither is the United States. We're not going away on this battle. And there's going to be an historic, momentous battle on the floor of the House and Senate over the wind and solar, all-electric vehicle, battery storage technology, tax breaks that we just put on the books in 2022 that has already unleashed $365 billion worth of public and private investment in clean energy technology and created 354,000 new jobs, 2 years. That's what's frightening the oil, gas, and coal industry. They can see how much bigger this is than even experts 2 years ago were predicting it would be. And so we're going to have a mighty battle, but 80% of all the money in the climate bill goes to Republican districts. So it's going to be very politically hazardous for many of these Republicans to be voting to remove subsidies that are creating hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of jobs in their states. Georgia, for example, is the center of the solar production that has been unleashed as part of the IRA. So this is going to be a very difficult situation for the Republicans on those votes. Congress is a stimulus response institution. There's nothing more stimulating than millions of people who are telling their elected representatives that you're about to cast a vote that will force me to lose my job. And that's what's already happened in the first 2 years, with more promise to come in the future. So it'll be a battle. Trump is committed to pulling us out of the Paris Agreement. He can do that unilaterally. What he can't do unilaterally is to pull America out of the IRA, out of the climate bill. He's going to need the votes in the House and the Senate to accomplish that. And he's going to need a majority in both places. It will not be easy for him to garner all of that support. And he may be successful for parts of it, but large portions of it are going to stay in place. And estimates are that if untouched, it would be $1 trillion worth of public subsidies and $3 to $4 trillion worth of private sector investment that it would unleash, according to Goldman Sachs and McKinsey. And that's what's frightening oil, gas, and coal. That's what would be threatening to anybody who represented the status quo on any issue at any time. It's coming, and it's coming very rapidly in their direction. So have hope. We're going to hold on to as much as we can right now. And the more successful they are is the more that there will be an unleashing of, yet again, a Green New Deal movement of young people all across America who will be coming back in 2026 in the election cycle to make sure that there's a restoration of the commitment of the United States to be the world leader on these issues, because we really can't ask other countries to do things that we're not doing ourselves. And I'm quite confident that that will be where we are in the 2026 election cycle. Okay, so please.
Thank you so much. In the session we had just prior to this one, we had some representatives from Treasury. And what was on everyone's mind is what you've just talked about was the IRA and the defending of it. And so there are two questions around that is, one, are there parts of the IRA or the infrastructure bill, I'd like both of you to answer, that are more vulnerable to roll back? Are there, and what are some of the pathways that we can defend this great climate legislation? What you have in the audience in terms of America's All In is you have representatives of business are here, representatives of universities are here, civil society, utilities. We have a really broad finance people are all here. And so we had a conversation and would love to hear how can we help in either strengthening, defending, taking over some of the things at the subnational and non-state actor level in terms of defending the IRA. So how do we defend that IRA?
Well, let me say two things about that, but let me start by commending the Treasury team. In my view, the best member of the cabinet on climate issues was and remains Janet Yellen. Treasury has over and over again stepped into the right direction when the administration was confused and provided leadership that repositioned the administration. So to the Treasury team, thumbs up, bravo, and thank you. You were the best. What we did the IRA through a parliamentary device called reconciliation that allows you to pass something through the Senate with a simple majority. What can be done with reconciliation can be undone with reconciliation. So I'll let Eddie talk more about this, but the key for American business interests, scientific interests, universities, research interests, is to make sure that you're letting Republican members of Congress know what this means, and particularly with small margins of majority, it can make a big difference. So there has to be a public outcry. The thing that I want to talk about in this context is not so much our IRA, but the EU and UK's CBAM, the carbon border tariff. That right now is the most powerful looming economic force on the planet to reduce carbon emissions. And if you look at what Potsdam and others are saying, there is no chance of a pathway to climate safety without putting a price on carbon. So the one that is coming at us is the CBAM. And with the EU and the UK both involved, that is critical to be defended. There's going to be enormous pressure from the fossil fuel industry to take the Trump administration and use it as a battering ram to try to knock down the CBAM. But the CBAM needs to be protected, because without it, and what I hope is an international cascade of carbon pricing that ensues, we are doomed to fail on climate. So that, I think, is another area where we really need to focus. I think the EU wants to stay firm on the CBAM. I think the UK wants to stay in the CBAM. It entered it under a conservative government. Now there's a Labour government. So the conditions are quite good. And when we pushed the IRA out, and all of Europe objected. Eddie and I were traveling in Europe then when it happened. Well, how could you do this to us? And what we said to them is, tough bounce, pound sand, do your own, and keep up. And so they're in a perfect position now to reciprocate and say to us when we whine about CBAM, tough bounce, pound sand, do your own, and keep up. And if that message holds, if they stick to their guns, a pathway to climate safety emerges.
Yep, thank you. So Lee Sheldon is the new designated head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. He will come before Sheldon and I for his confirmation hearing. He voted 40 times in the House of Representatives to repeal the IRA, to repeal all the tax breaks for wind and solar, all electric vehicles. So what we're going to have is an enormous opportunity with his nominees, Trump's nominees, for them to be forced to publicly defend something which runs completely contrary to what public opinion actually supports. Those tax breaks poll out at 70%. When you say wind and solar, all electric vehicles, battery storage technologies, 70%, 70%, 70%, 70%. And what we'll be able to do is to create an atmospheric in which those Republicans who may be thinking about voting in a reconciliation bill to repeal all of those key incentives for clean energy technologies to understand that within a very brief period of time, for them, 2026, that they will be held accountable. And so our job and your job as well, is to have your voices be heard, to be working with your partners in the United States. People get discouraged. People can sometimes feel that they gave it all they had as a sprint and not accept the fact that this is a marathon. And we kind of, in a Boston Marathon metaphor, we've kind of hit Heartbreak Hill. And people are feeling a little tired, but you can't be tired, because it could all be decided in the next 3 months, 4 months. And we're just going to have high energy, battle them back, save as much as we can save, and then in 2026, start building it even higher and higher. So that would be my recommendation to the people who are here, to partner with all of their allies to make sure that people don't get discouraged, because you today are working based upon all of the achievements of the preceding generation of clean energy and environmental advocates.
All right, thank you so much. We're sitting here at COP, and we know that the last time, in fact, part of our origin story was that in 2017, the first Trump administration pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. So looking forward, assuming that that may happen, you both mentioned that that might be a true possibility, how do we, as Americans, show up on the international stage? How do we show up at COP? One of the big issues for this COP is climate finance. It's time to renew and re-up and go from the 100 billion up to, hopefully triple or more of that a year. So again, this is a legislative action in terms of, approving money. How do we, under this circumstances, how do we show up on climate finance? What do we say to the negotiators here today that are trying to negotiate this new NCOG, which is basically the new money, climate finance, from the global north to the global south, here at COP? Any thoughts?
One thought is that for a very long time, the fossil fuel industry has maneuvered this conversation into a place where the donors to a loss and damage fund were all governments. And the fossil fuel industry stood to the side, having caused the problem, having created the loss and damage, without a nickel in contribution being demanded of it. So it was very interesting to me that when the COP29 host letter came out, our hosts here actually suggested that there was a role for industry itself, the people who actually did the loss and the damage, the polluters, in the loss and damage fund. And there's, I think, CFAF is the acronym for what they're working on through that right now. So I hope we can continue to make progress on this. And I guess I'd just say that we got through the last Trump administration. We got through because of organizations like yours, pulling together states and tribal groups and advocacy groups and, people generally, to put the kind of pressure that Eddie was talking about onto the political system. And if anything, because of that economic point I was making earlier, that pressure on the political system is even more powerful right now. So you have economic wins at your back when you're putting that pressure on. Ed?
Yep. No, thank you. When I was growing up in Malden, Massachusetts, a city of about 65,000 people just north of Boston, which is where I still live, every city has an environmental sacrifice zone. So that's the ward that I grew up in, the environmental sacrifice ward. And the Malden River was 3 blocks from my house. My mother said to me when I was 10, whatever you do, Eddie, don't swim in the Malden River, because it was black with a pre-Jimi Hendrix purple haze over it, because the coal companies, the chemical companies. Every Converse All-Star rubber was made right on the Mullen River. Well, when we passed the IRA and we did the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we made sure there was more funding in the United States for those environmental sacrifice zones, so that there was environmental justice to those communities who had always been the most adversely impacted by the industrialization era. Somebody pays the price for all the wealth that gets created in the Stoves Wars. Well, today, we now have environmental sacrifice zones, but they're islands. They're countries around the world who are the most negatively impacted. And what this COP has to do, and what the United States has to contribute to, is to ensure that there's financing for those countries, that there is loss and damage recognition, that there is a sense of responsibility, that the United States, which historically has actually sent up 25% of all the historic CO2, is red, white, and blue. So we have an obligation to make sure that the funding is there, that we help these countries. And with Trump, it'll be hard in the appropriations process, but that doesn't mean that we can't set the goal high. From the World Bank to the Exim Bank to the International Monetary Fund to all of these global agencies, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are putting together the largest funding sources possible to help to remediate and also to give protections to those countries. And because they have, in many instances, not even industrialized yet. They're not even major contributors to it. So they have a very good case to be here saying, what's the financing model? What are you going to do to help us? And that's our message. Our message is, yes, you're right. We do have a responsibility. That we can't have countries and islands being environmental sacrifice zones as well. So we're going to be here delivering that message.
Right. So, Senator Whitehouse, you had talked a lot about trade policy.
Yep.
And, also the Trump administration has thought a lot about changes in trade policy. Is there any common ground here in terms of using trade policy in order to, protect American industry and jobs from higher carbon manufactured industrial goods imported for countries with little or no environmental and climate regulation? Is there any way that we can use trade policy as a positive in some senses and have a common language around trade that may be able to achieve, common goals?
Yes, I think there absolutely is, and I think that's what the EU and the UK are seeking to accomplish through the application of the CBAM. From the United States point of view, we're actually in a very fortunate position because even if we do nothing and the EU and UK go forward with their tariffs and American companies have to pay tariffs on exports to the EU and the UK, we are still better off economically with that tariff regime because other economies, particularly the Chinese, are going to be paying 3 times the tariff. So that will offset the low labor, high pollution advantage of China and is predicted to move enormous amounts of manufacturing and jobs to the United States. So even if we just do nothing, we win. Now, the fossil fuel industry is going to want to defeat that win for America because they couldn't care less about America. What they care about is their profits, and they don't want to have us solve that problem of being tariffed by having an internal carbon price that would reduce their sales. So we'll have to tangle with them, but the underlying facts are very, very good for us. And I totally endorse what Eddie said about making sure that our global environmental sacrifice zones are not overlooked and are stood up. But it's important to recognize that if we don't solve the underlying emissions problem, there is no amount of loss and damage funding that makes that whole. We absolutely have to solve the emissions problem, And no one will benefit more from really solving the emissions problem than those who are in those sacrifice zones. So we got to relentlessly keep our eye on job one, which is where are the emissions? And then in the context of that, also provide the necessary financial support so that the rank injustice of what's taking place can be ameliorated.
Right. You had talked, Senator Markey, you had talked about in the U.S. economy and the impact of climate change on the insurance market and how that rolls out into the housing market, et cetera. You know, Americans are obviously very concerned about, you know, the high cost of living, the affordability of housing, and other issues of inflation. And so going forward, you know, is again, you know, we talked about the IRA and the stickiness of it. In fact, it was funny, yesterday Governor Inslee said, we need to make the IRA sticky, like trying to take candy from a 5-year-old. It just can't be done, right? So the question is, how do we talk about the IRA in terms of, maybe we've been using the word incentives, but really talk about it in terms of tax cuts, which is a very, you know, popular way of speaking in the upcoming Trump administration, that really gets to the heart of, you know, the American economy, these jobs that we talked about, you know, Americans having a way future and feeling tied to this new clean energy economy.
I think that's a perfect frame, talking about it in terms of tax cuts. So Trump says the IRA, all these tax breaks for wind and solar, socialism. Got to get rid of socialism in America. Well, what does he call tax breaks for the oil, gas, and coal industry for 100 years? Well, you'd have to call it socialism. And he's not calling for the repeal of those tax breaks. He's not threatening to put that in the reconciliation bill to take away all of their tax benefits. So all we're saying that if you're not going to take that away, then give us some of that socialism for wind and solar and all electric vehicles. Give us the same opportunities on a level playing field. Otherwise, you're going to keep jobs and the development in the oil states and the gas states and take them away from the other states, where 80% of the money has gone into red state Republican districts. And that's just discriminatory. After we finally level the playing field after 100 years, all of a sudden, they are offended, you know, that there are tax breaks that actually subsidize the private sector, when that's been the business model of the fossil fuel industry for 100 years, including not making them pay for all the damage which they have caused in communities across the country. So, again, Sheldon and I, we're going to be up. We're going to be up preaching this gospel, okay, about the hypocrisy coefficient that's going to be so high, and ultimately those tax breaks, which are going to create hundreds of thousands and millions of jobs in the United States in a new clean energy economy. And if we don't do it, then China and India and Germany and other countries will, and we'll wind up importing their products eventually. And we won't have anything to export to the rest of the world because we won't be making them. So Elon Musk knows this better than anybody. And I'm not hearing him say, after the federal government subsidized the creation of his company, after we, you know, created the environment where SpaceLink could even exist, where all of a sudden he's going to be going there and maybe trying to figure out a way of having the tax breaks removed that would help his competitors at Tesla, because he thinks he's already got a competitive advantage. That's a debate we're looking forward to having, because we think it's an unlosable debate from our side as we target those red states that are job creation, manufacturing opportunities, and yeah, we're going to We're going to make the argument that we're going to engage in massive job creation as we save all of God's creation, okay? And that job creation is going to be largely in red states, and I don't think that ultimately they're going to want to take away those tax breaks.
Thank you. So we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to see if I could take some questions from the audience before we wrap up. Do we have any?
While the questions are coming in, can I say just a quick word about inflation? Biden administration got tagged with inflation. But if you look at what actually happened, the inflation was driven first by gas prices, run up deliberately by the fossil fuel industry and its international cartel. And then if you look at the components of inflation, you move then on to homeowners insurance and auto insurance, which in many places have tripled and quadrupled and are going no place but up. And then you look into the agricultural supply chain where droughts and floods are crushing agricultural production. Shipping is being jammed up in droughted Panama Canal traffic.
Mississippi River.
Mississippi River traffic. I mean, there is a story to tell on inflation, that inflation is the product of the fossil fuel industry, both price gouging with its product and creating inflation with its emissions.
Great. Okay, questions? We have one question here. We've got two questions, one here and one there.
Thank you, Senators. My name is Allison Gakad. I'm a climate journalist. I report on carbon markets and climate policy. This is a question primarily for Senator Whitehouse. You've worked on multiple iterations of a U.S. CBAM in the past, and there were reports that you're now working on a bipartisan one. So if you could provide updates on that, as well as your outlook on, given Republican control of the Congress and executive branch, how you think that'll fare.
It's a little hard to predict, but there's some positive signals. First of all, there's been a pretty robust bipartisan conversation taking place in the Senate for quite a while. I would say while the people in and around the room move about a little bit, it's roughly been 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And we have a support team to work through technical issues with RFF and Silverado, which come from different perspectives but are working kind of as a team. So there's a very robust information platform that we're working out of. That generated my bill on the Democratic side. It generated the Cassidy-Graham bill on the Republican side. So there's, that's not a bad start, and there's room for continued progress. Lighthizer is probably going to have a return to an important trade role in the Trump administration. He was his trade ambassador. He has spoken very powerfully about how useful it is to have a border tariff on high polluting imports. So there's a platform there as well. Again, the fossil fuel industry, never underestimate their malicious and malign behavior. For years, they've said carbon pricing is what they want. And they've said that at the time that they made the political bet that it could never happen. Now that we're getting closer to this, what does Darren Woods say as the CEO of Exxon just the other day? Oh no, we can't have carbon pricing. These carbon border tariffs are a bad idea. I think the fact that he is now switching his propaganda spout against this is a sign that they see this as increasingly real. And the fact that the EU and the UK are doing it, and the only way we get out, if they hold to their guns, the only way we get out from under their tariffs is to have a carbon price of our own, is an additional motivation in all of this. So those are some of the potentially powerful forces, I should say, that are working in the direction of it. And ultimately, if you believe in success, I think this is an essential waypoint on the way to success. If we fail at this waypoint, we fail at the journey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senators. Allie McGuigan with National Grid. So I just wanted to say, Senator Markey, it's an honor to serve your constituents and provide them the power they need. And
she abandoned Rhode Island.
And Senator Whitehouse, we really do appreciate your leadership on offshore wind, though. And so that was going to be my question on the Collaborate Act and your support for the necessary transmission infrastructure to support the offshore wind industry. Kind of what is your sense looking forward now, given what's happened kind of for the future of the offshore wind industry, and to both of you, maybe some of your legislative priorities next Congress at EPW. Would be great to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
I think the offshore wind industry has been battered by slow work at BOEM and NOAA, the supply chain difficulties that COVID caused, and a lot of competition for the rather scarce, huge vessels that are necessary to do the installations and trying to get the construction timing right. So I think we need permitting reform. I think we need permitting reform that proves out with very, very significant emissions reductions. And I've let the participants in that discussion know that a part of permitting reform to get my vote is going to be collaborate and RISE, which is a very important related offshore wind bill. And if we can put that together, and I'll hand it off to Eddie now, but we may be able to put that together in EPW. The offshore wind piece was not jurisdictional to Energy and Natural Resources, so when it was not in their permitting bill, that was not necessarily a fatal sign. That was just jurisdictional stuff, parliamentary jurisdictional stuff. So we may be able to do it, and we'll see if there's common ground with the incoming chair of the EPW committee, Shelley Moore-Capito.
Right. So we're almost at time. So what I'd like, though, you answer the question, but also give you an opportunity to make a final comment to the audience, and final message that you'd like them to take away.
We urge all of the offshore wind companies and the federal agencies that they have to get permission to construct to get it all done by January 20th of 2025. Run, don't walk. Work weekends. Get it all done. It'll be hard for Trump, who has a recessive environmental gene that only shows up when it's talking about offshore wind. All of a sudden, he cares about the environment. So that's going to show up again, as it did in 2017 through 2020, as they slow-walked Vineyard Wind and they slow-walked other utility-scale projects. So, without question, the natural gas industry feels greatly threatened by the 30,000 megawatt construction promise that the Biden administration made to the East Coast of the United States. That's 30,000 megawatts that will remove the need for natural gas generation along the East Coast. That's why they had a meeting with Harold Hamm. That's why he said, if you give me $1 billion, I'll take all those environmental regulations off the books. Offshore wind is a Death Star for further natural gas installation along the East Coast. They know it. So, number one, move fast, lock in all of the regulatory permission slips you're going to need in order to finish the projects that are already at that stage. And then Senator Whitehouse and I, we're going to continue to work on a bipartisan basis, as we did in the past, for example, in 2020, to have an extension by 5 years of the offshore wind production tax break. And we're going to continue because it's a major project for the Bay State and the Ocean State to have our waters be used to generate this electricity. And we're going to need all of you to be all in. We're right and they're wrong on all these issues. And the science is on our side. And the wind is blowing in our back, okay, for all of these offshore wind projects. And I'm not going to finish up because I'm going to hand it back over to Sheldon so he can do it.
What he said. But it's not just the science that it is at our back. It's actually the politics that are actually also at our back, although there's a fortress of denial in the fossil fuel industry, and now the economics is at our back. So with work, we will win. Edmund Burke said, never despair. And when you do, work on in despair.
Well, please join me for a really welcome. Thank you to our speakers for joining us and for their words. Thank you so much.